and welcome to the Survival Training channel. Today's video is a bit special. Following many requests and questions on social media, we have decided. The Survival Training team has decided to put a document online, a document that will interest the entire survivalist community, especially collapse theorists, but also anyone interested in survival. This is an unpublished document that was prepared by the Survival Training team in collaboration with field military personnel, officials, and that we have decided to put online today. This document is the scale of safety degradation. It's a document that is empirical, descriptive, and really meant to be useful, to be used in the field. We will look at the different ways to use this scale. This scale, intended for civilians, will allow us to prepare, to acquire reference points, and to start from a solid foundation. It will also help us move away from certain fantasies or become aware of certain events that will probably happen sooner or later. Before presenting it to you, I have to tell you that it's a document that is complete, but of course it can be subject to many criticisms. You will see that inside the different columns you have various events that are generally listed in an order that is roughly chronological, following the different conflicts or events that may occur. This scale is actually a framework that will allow us to interpret a situation on the scale of a Western or Westernized country in 2020. Inside each column, as you will see, the different elements are mixed together. They can belong to different spheres, such as the political, military, social, or economic sphere. So, I repeat, chronological order has been prioritized. Now we're going to talk about the use of this safety degradation scale. What is it used for? How is it actually usable? So, there are four main uses for this scale. The first is that it will give you a real idea of the situation in the near future in your country, in your environment. So, it will help you structure your thinking a bit to know where you stand, to know what you can expect. The second way to use it is as a scale that will allow you to start from a given situation and define your needs. So, for example, if you have a fallback base, what survivalists call a bug-out bag, well, you have equipment in that bug-out bag. So that will allow you to choose your equipment based on a situation you might eventually expect. So you'll be able to list everything he has in the column you choose. Overall of degradation, ultimately of safety. And once you've listed all the items you find in the column, you'll be able to define your needs. And how do you equip a bug-out bag? So you, for example, the third way to use this scale is that it will allow you to check if equipment or an installation meets an expected level of degradation. So typically, you'll be able to take your evacuation bag and go through the elements of this scale with it. And you'll be able to match a piece of equipment to a set of elements located in a column. That way, you'll be able to see if there are any gaps in your equipment, if it can be improved, or if there are unnecessary things that can be removed. The fourth way to use this scale is that it will allow you to clearly define a level of deterioration that will require an evacuation. So it's pretty easy when you're alone solo to decide whether to evacuate or not. However, if you're with family or a group, it's more complicated since sensitivities differ. So it would be better to have previously agreed on a level of deterioration at which the family or group will decide to evacuate. So you can choose an element that seems major to you on the deterioration scale for potential evacuation. It's better to use multiple elements to confirm the elements a little bit and to be sure that you have reached a level of deterioration that will force you to leave the home and proceed with an evacuation anyway. Now we're going to look at the safety degradation scale. The safety degradation scale We'll look at the columns one by one. You have a link under the video to download the PDF. I recommend printing it out and displaying it so you can track any possible deterioration in your area of residence. So the stability phase is phase 0, so nothing to report. Phase 1 is the disturbance phase. So here we're starting to have a number of items that are listed. So we have local and occasional security measures. So here, for example, when you have a strike, you have street blockades, etc. These are very simple things that can happen very often. Official safety instructions. Let's begin. You have safety instructions that are usually broadcast by major media or others, or by the authorities in public places. Authorized demonstrations are standard, with frequent strikes. So you have to understand that what's listed in each column, you have to see that it corresponds to something normal. It becomes the norm. So here we're in a state of disruption. Then you have areas where traffic is prohibited. So those are blockades set up by the authorities. Disrupted road traffic and everything that comes with it, disrupted rail transport, local pollution, so you can have episodes of local pollution. We've already seen that with, for example, alternating traffic. So there, you have official safety instructions. They tell you, for example, only cars with even numbered license plates will be allowed. So then you have local natural disruptions. So you might have cold weather plans, etc. Or storms, things like that, local health crisis, local industrial accident. So here, you have to understand that it's really, very occasional. Deterioration of guarantees on financial assets. These issues belong to the economic sphere. Financial. So here, you start to have this kind of thing in phase 1. You start to see these kinds of things happening. So generally it goes unnoticed. We don't really realize it, but if you're paying attention, it can be a sign. For example, today you often see guarantee downgrades on financial assets. Local terrorist attacks and local bank or store runs are localized events. For example, we saw a local bank run in 2018 and 2019 in Italy. There were banks that closed, so there were bank runs, but they didn't become widespread. These were local bank runs. Now for phase 2 erosion, the tougher part. So there were unauthorized protests, so we had some of those. For example, we had protests that took place even though they weren't authorized. There hadn't been any prior requests and so on. We had some in 2019 popular gatherings that were a bit bigger. Checkpoints, well, checkpoints are pretty standard. We've had some that were set up by the authorities where everyone who looked like a protester was systematically searched. So checkpoints are still something a bit unusual. It's been a long time since there were any on public roads. Wild roadblocks, so here, these are roadblocks organized by protesters. General strikes, supply problems at stations in service. So that's quite sensitive. It goes along with the strikes, surge in fuel prices. So here, it's the same. There's a slight increase in erosion. Then you have the problems with the supply of medicines and supplies. That's quite sensitive too. These supply chains are quite sensitive. It's pretty fast. Physical violence. So here, it's physical violence that is starting to become the norm and usually happens on the sidelines of protests. General rights requisition. Here, it's tied directly to the bottom line. The chart has a line in gray, in a range of grays. There, you should know that when a state of emergency is declared, you have a general right of requisition. So you can have weapons, your vehicle, the gold from financial repression, etc. Massive immigration. Obviously, you would have destabilization, so you would start to see an erosion of the system. Frequent outages, electricity, gas, water, telecom. So there you have it. We're sinking deeper into erosion. Household waste often isn't collected. Financial repression. So financial repression. You can have all kinds of taxes, all kinds of asset freezes, etc. So you need to be aware of that. Control of information channels. That's also related to the state of emergency. You can control information channels. In 2015, during a state of emergency, the channels were not truly controlled. It wasn't done, but it could be. Censorship that begins arbitrary arrests, intermittent shortages of food and fuel. It's always the same here. There's a progression or even a decline. Closure of schools. Now, you should know that schools are among the most fragile institutions, which shut down rather quickly. As soon as there start to be some problems, especially with food for the cafeterias, fuel, and so on, schools are quickly closed, or at least intermittently. You can have rationing, and then you start to have corruption. We're really talking about corruption here. Widespread, that becomes the norm. Phase 3. You have what is called the breakdown of the system or the country. So you can have environmental peril in there. So environmental peril, you can have droughts, heavy rains, massive storms, and so on, or even cyclones and things like that. Major nuclear accident. We imagine ending guarantees on financial assets. So it comes pretty quickly. As soon as the system is really disrupted, you get these kinds of announcements made just before bank failures. And then usually what follows very quickly is the loss of the value of the currency. So here overall, people who are fairly well off, the rentiers, etc., are quickly euthanized. Breakdown of supply chains. So it becomes the norm. So can you imagine? Shutdown of postal and delivery services. So here, when we got to the breakdown of supply chains, we reached the shutdown of postal services, which in the end is still quite fragile, which is more resilient as an institution, more resilient than schools, but which stops fairly quickly. Reduced volume and variety of commercial trade, shopping centers closing. It's the same major problem here. Closure of financial services, pharmacies, and ATMs, if not already closed. Abandonment of social and medical social structures. Well, here we can imagine nursing homes, etc. Here it's really becoming, here we're really in a phase of deconstruction. So you can have major terrorist attacks that are about at that level. Riots. Here you have riots. Collapse of solidarity happens very quickly. It's at that level that we clearly notice them. Electric rail transport is out of service. So diesel rail transport is more resilient, so we can possibly still run trains on certain lines, especially if they're militarized with diesel. Mass unemployment, so the same massive non-employment in reality. Stopping of unemployment benefits, retirement, and social minimums. So if that hasn't already happened, it will happen very quickly. These are shifts that can happen in just a few days within the same week. Development of the informal economy, bartering and looting as a consequence, violence with firearms, which is starting to become really regular. Phase 4 is the breaking point. So deploying security forces, source, E.D.S. So that's very noticeable. Curfew, militarized checkpoints. So it's starting to get seriously reinforced. Requisition of buildings, distribution of food supplies, possibly abduction, disappearance, torture, assassination, attack on armed personnel. So that's when we see all the weapon thefts, etc. Because you have armed factions that are generally formed, attacking police stations, gendarmerie, stealing weapons, drastic drop in information. Private vehicle traffic halted, movement limited. At this point, it's no longer possible due to fuel and safety concerns. So closure of banks, closure of the last shops, so now we're sinking deeper. Another decline, disappearance of the press. permanently, end of commercial port activities. You might possibly have a port is still more resilient than a lot of other things. So you might still possibly have small boats docking with a bit of activity if it's secure. Police open fire on the population. Here it's the same. This is a breaking point as shifts occur at that moment. A coup d'etat, by the way. Conscription and military conflict, these are conflicts between official forces, armed insurrection. So here, these are official forces. Well, it's a state against forces that are not official. Revolution. So a revolution, unlike an armed insurrection, comes to an end and there is a radical change. Law enforcement rebellions are often associated with officers firing on the public. Subtitling ST 501. Phase 5 is the collapse phase, so the end of public services, halt of imports, widespread shortages, shortage of drinking water, closure of civilian airports. We might still have military airports. You should know that airports, contrary to what you might think, are very resilient. Even civilian airports, under an abandoned road network, impassable movement, armed faction clashes, snipers, barricades, forced conscription, executions, deportations, destroyed networks, ruined buildings, abandoned homes, unused prisons, depopulation, corpses, famine, epidemics, mass exodus, major disasters, and acts of war. Indeed, you could have a large-scale nuclear conflict at that level, for example. Phase 6 is the extinction phase, so the disappearance of human life, an uninhabitable area. So you'll notice that at the very bottom of the table, there are purple arrows, which are actually markers. So you should understand these markers as reference points. Notable, easy to observe, which are among the most revealing events when it comes to a phase change. You can have a phase change, of course, without the marker having appeared. But in any case, if you have a real shift, the marker will soon appear. So we look at these markers. From phase 0 to phase 1, we have the official instructions that are given through the media. Generally, phase 2, phase 3, phase 1, phase 2. These are the checkpoints. Phase 2, phase 3. We have the closure of shopping centers from 3 to 4, deployment of security forces, from 4 to 5 depopulation. From collapse in phase 5 to extinction in phase 6, human life disappears. Above the purple markers, you have the gray line where you have exceptional measures, legislative provisions that we know. So you have the state of vigilance. Those are the 3 levels of Vigipirate, which are associated with Operation Sentinel carried out by our soldiers. Well, it's a system that has become permanent, so you already have it starting from phase 0. In reality now, you have the state of emergency, which has been put in place in 2015. Before, we had New Caledonia in '84, and we also had the suburbs in 2005. You are under siege. So here, we're dealing with a constitutional measure that transfers police powers to the military authority. So the state of siege has not been implemented under the Fifth Republic. The last time was during the Second World War and the state of war as well. The state of war, Second World War. One last time to answer the questions I was asked. For example, if I take the case, classic example of the bug-out bag and its inventory in the field of survivalism. The advice you'll be given will have no relevance as long as the context of the evacuation hasn't been clearly defined. This document is here for that, to give you a complete overview of the situations that could arise. Finally, this scale will allow you to make rational choices and structure your preparation. I hope it will be useful to you, and I'll see you soon for a future video on the Survey Formation channel.